There's a church. It's a church where some tremendous things were happening. There were great miracles that the congregation didn't make a huge thing of, but thanked God humbly for. There were people around the edges of that congregation in the city in which they lived, called Corinth, that didn't quite fit in, that were overlooked, that didn't get the support they needed from the government agencies, that slipped through the cracks. And the church in that city made sure that they were cared for. The church met in lots of small homes around the area with 20, 30, 40 people that would meet in them and share food together and do all kinds of wonderful things. The church grew. Word of mouth went round and they spoke one with another, and people gossiped about this gospel with their neighbours. Then they felt that some of the homes that the church met in were a bit more important than the other ones, because the miracles that they did, or that God did obviously, were more important than the ones that were done in some of the other homes. In fact, some of the other homes, the Bible teaching there wasn't actually that good. The speakers were a bit long-winded, like me now. And there began to be a competition. And then they would see a family who were quite rich and say, well, why don't you come and join our part of the church rather than that one? We have brilliant brioche and coffee after the service. And all the time in one of these small gatherings, 3 elderly ladies sat at the back and watched. They watched with joy to begin with, and heavy hearts as things began to change. They weren't cynical, they weren't gossipy, they weren't bitchy, but their hearts were heavy. Faith, hope and love sat at the back of the church together, and they wondered what was going on and when God might step in and, as it were, speak to them. One day Tychicus came to them. He was Paul's postman. Paul had planted the church many years before. Paul was now under house arrest, wasn't allowed out, but he was allowed to write some letters, and he sent Tychicus with these letters. Always he would start by giving them Ephesians. That was the based letter that they would read out to the whole of the congregation, and then there would be a personal letter, and this one was a letter called Corinthians, later to be called 1 Corinthians, because Paul had to write 2 Corinthians. And faith, hope and love listened, as did everyone else. The room became quiet as Paul spoke to them. And he spoke to them in chapter 12 about spiritual gifts and how important they were. And then he went into chapter 13, and you could hear a pin drop as the leader of that church, a lady, read out these words.
If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I taught like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away the childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall be known fully, even as I am fully known. And now these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love. but the greatest of these is love.
Thanks, Nicola. Faith, hope and love, they're not three elderly ladies as I creatively imagined them going back 2,000 years, but three things that Paul says in his letter sent via Tychicus that would remain. When Paul says remain, some biblical commentators thought that Paul said they will remain in eternity when prophecy and all of those things that Nicola mentioned cease, that those three will remain in eternity. But that doesn't make sense, does it? Because we won't need hope in eternity. In eternity, we won't hope for food on the table. We won't hope for good weather or any of those things. I think what Paul is saying here is that these three will remain. These should be the baseline characteristics of those of us who follow Jesus. They should be the things that don't go off, that are imperishables. Remember that clip right at the top of the service? That people should look at us as followers of Jesus and think, there's a person of faith and of hope and of love. You may think this whole passage is about love. Why does then Paul lump in faith and hope with them at the end? Doesn't he take it off on a tangent? No, not really. They are one thing together in so many of the writings in Scripture. Paul always puts faith, hope and love together. In Romans, Ephesians, Colossians, both the Thessalonians, in Hebrews and in 1 Peter, they are a singular verb. And also in the early church, when we read the letter of Barnabas and a letter sent by Polycarp, one of the early church leaders, they always talk about faith, hope and love. What they're saying is you can't just have one and not the others. You can't say, well, I'm really faithful, but I'm not very loving, so you'll get a lot of faith from me, but I'm very cold. It's faith, hope and love that are all together. Today we're thinking about faith. What is faith? Let's look at faith through the eyes of a child.
Faith. Faith is more than just believing. It's knowing. While many of us are strong in our faith, others struggle. A little more patience. What if everyone would just listen a little bit more? How much better would this world be? Faith lives, faith loves, faith grows. Faith counts.
Faith counts. Whether we're a child or we're in our 90s, faith counts. But what is faith? Mark Twain said, faith isn't believing what you know ain't true. I love that phrase. Faith isn't ejecting your brain at the door when you come into a church building for worship. I meet so many people that think, oh, you're a Christian, Neil, so you can't believe in science then. I said, well, hang on a minute, why? Oh, because you believe in this faith thing, this spiritual stuff, so you can't believe in science. There's this belief amongst some that you can't be a thinking person if you're a faith person. It's simply not true. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word for faith is emunah, and it means truth, honesty and loyalty as they're found in God. They are characteristics of God. So in the Old Testament, there's a huge focus on who God is. Imagine this: if you're in Egypt as a slave, you've been there 373 years as a people, all of your loved ones who knew freedom are dead and gone. The Jewish people always write about God, but they don't just call God God, do they? They often say that God, the father of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. They're always reminding themselves, our God has a history with us. Our God has turned up in the past. Our God is faithful to us. And that is core for the Jewish people, whether they're in slavery, in the promised land, or they're back in captivity in Babylonia. Wherever they are, they're saying, we can look back and find strength to have faith in God for tomorrow. And in New Testament, the Greek word for faith is pistis. It's a word that Paul uses 142 times in his letters. It's one of his main words. And Spyros Zohadiets, if that's how you pronounce his name, forgive me, he says in his book that pistis, faith, is knowledge of, assent to, confidence in the gospel which produces good works. It's knowledge of. It's knowing facts and ideas. It's to be able to say, I know about God. I'm familiar with this material. But that's not enough to be a follower of Jesus. Let's be honest, the devil has that kind of faith. He knows about God, although he doesn't follow God. Many people know about God, but that's not enough. The next thing is that it's an assent to. It's approval and agreement. It's saying, I not only know this in theory or as facts, but I accept this God. I know about this God and I accept this God. That becomes more personal. That's not theory out there. That's not a word study of the Bible. That's something that knocks at the door of our hearts. And yet still we can say no if we want to. But at this point, faith is saying, I accept this God. This is saying, God, I turn away from all those things that I've done that are wrong. When I miss the mark. That's the literal Greek translation of sin, to miss the mark. Sometimes we think of sin as those big things that appear on the front page of the newspapers. But actually it's all those little things that we do, that I do, that you do as well. And when we accept God, we're saying, I want to turn away from those. I'm sorry for them. And I turn, God, instead to you. It's knowledge of God. It's an assent to God. And then it's a confidence in God. The Greek there means I feel really certain about this God. I'm going to give my life to him. It's I trust God. Do you see the dynamic there of I know about God, I'm going to give my life to God, and I'm going to keep trusting my life to God. Because I don't know about you, but once you make that decision to follow Jesus, however woolly and wobbly it might be, or however clear-cut it might be, there are times when we wobble and when we maybe think, I've got to just re-trust God again in my life. And what's it faith in? It's faith in the God of the gospel. What is the gospel? We spent 6 weeks looking at the gospel according to different people and how they related to God. The gospel is literally in the Greek, good news. So church should be a joyful place. It should be a place where we're thinking, whoa, God's big story gives me joy. Now I get that in the midst of that joy, there is crud. There are difficult, dark times where we think, God, can I have a duvet day today from life? But the underlying foundation is a joy at the good news of what God has done. And that good news is that Jesus came and lived the life we can't live and died the death we should die so that we could have a relationship with God and become a part of God's wider kingdom of God movement, which includes the church. It's not a barcode to eternity. Beep, I'm there, I can do what I want with my life now. It's, God, I'm in. I know about you, I believe in you, and I'm going to trust my life to you. and we begin that journey with God. And it's a faith that produces good works. James, in the New Testament, one of Jesus' brothers, writes a letter that's quite black and white and quite blunt. And in it at one point he says, faith without deeds is dead. And he's not saying there, oh, you'll only have faith if you are a good person. What he's saying is faith is your foundation, that belief that Jesus has changed things. But if that really is the foundation of your life, good works will bubble up out of it. I'm a bit annoyed with John Knight, one of our ministers at the moment. He's planted his tomato seeds and I planted mine about the same time. And when the weather was cold, he took his in to the house. Apparently Sabre wasn't very pleased that their dining room became an allotment. But I left mine out in the greenhouse because I love and respect my wife and having our house as a home rather than an allotment. It's just the way it is, John. You're going to have to take it on the chin, my friend. And John came in very humbly and said, my tomato plants are this big. I thought, well done, John, they're as big as you. I'm really pleased for you. But mine are tiny, they're barely growing. Why were John's so big? Because he'd done something with them. That seed hadn't just been planted and stayed in the cold, damp soil. He'd cared for it, he'd nurtured it. And so they grew. Whereas mine I'd done nothing with. And so you could barely see them. There was still a seed, there was still faith there, but it was next to nothing. You are an advert for Jesus. Most people don't read the paper leather-bound version of the Bible, but they certainly read the flesh and blood version. At work, at school, in your neighbourhood, at the school gate, in your friendship group, in your book club, in your running club, wherever it is, people watch us as followers of Jesus. And they want to know one simple thing. Does this faith thing work? Because if it doesn't work, I've got enough things in my life on my to-do list. I don't just need another one to keep me morally centred. I want to know that this Jesus is alive and he makes a difference in your world. Al Morris, in the Dictionary of Paul and his Letters, says, he, that's Paul, speaks of Christ dwelling in the hearts of believers through faith, which points to an ongoing activity, not a fleeting visit. Faith is not static, but must grow. I remember my faith beginning when I was 12 years old on a Boys' Brigade and Girls' Brigade camp in Wales, in a field that stank of cowpats. I remember sitting in a marquee that was damp and leaked as a man who is, I don't even remember where he is now, but that's the beauty of God. He shared, Don Bridle shared about Jesus. And towards the end of that week, I thought, I can't keep taking all the good stuff from the church, playing football, being in the table tennis team, flirting with girls who run away from me at great speed. I can't just take that and pretend that Jesus isn't real. I've either got to be all in with Jesus or I need to ditch church and Boys' Brigade. And so at that point on a Thursday evening, somebody, I can't remember who, prayed with me on a wooden bench that was uncomfortable. And I said, Jesus, I know about you and I want to believe in you. And I began to have my trust in that God who is faithful and loyal to us. About 9 years ago, I was in Martha's Vineyard in America, where I was checking out all the places where Jaws was filmed. And I was walking along on a 6-mile walk and it was drizzly. And there were a few cars that went by splashing the side of my legs. It was warm though, so I had shorts on and a cagoule and I just couldn't really concentrate. And then all of a sudden, with the sea lapping at my left-hand side, I heard a voice in my mind. Remember Nicola talking about God guiding her here to Tonbridge? And I sensed that it was God's voice. And it simply said this, you have nothing to prove. And I thought, yeah, I know that, God. And I'd just come off an intense conversation with the minister I was working with in Bessells Green about a decision that the elders were going to do. Would they allow me to be the chaplain at Tonbridge Angels Football Club or not? It was completely out of my hand. I was on the other side of the globe. They could have said in that meeting, no, we don't think Neil should do it, or yes, he could. And I knew that it was a thing I would maybe be able to add some life to. So I was on edge, my life in the hands of others. Yeah, I know that, God. Neil, you have nothing to prove. Yeah, I know. Neil, you have nothing to prove to your church. Oh, hang on a minute. That faltered my steps. You have nothing to prove to your family. You have nothing to prove to yourself. That one smarted a bit, because I like the odd medal like anyone else. And then what broke me was hearing God in my mind say, you have nothing to prove to me. And it reminded me that it was all of Jesus. That it wasn't about what I do, it's about what Jesus has done. And that my faith is a response to everything that God has done through Jesus. Nothing more, nothing less. And at that moment, walking along that drizzle, I wept like a child that had grazed his knees and didn't know where his daddy or his mummy was. As it flooded through me afresh, Neil, you have nothing to prove. And since then, in my journey of faith, there has been a lightness in my job as a Baptist minister. Not always. Sometimes I've taken it back to try and prove things. But when I do that, I always hear that voice again, Neil, you have nothing to prove. My faith was growing. My wife said I could share this. At the beginning of this year, my father-in-law, who'd been the minister here for a quarter of a century, Derek Hills, retired properly at the age of 75 from being a Baptist minister. He preached his final sermon. He went out into the car park apparently and said, yes, I'm done. And the very next week began to not feel very well. So unwell to the point in the midst of lockdown that Joe and I looked up the government rulings through my PA Helen to make sure that we were doing the legal right thing, and we realised that Joe could and should go down and care for her mum and dad. And her brother Seb flew over from Singapore. And I looked after the kids and did other things here at the church whilst Joe nursed her dad, and we would talk on Skype amidst tears. I found it so hard that I couldn't go down and physically say goodbye to my father-in-law when we knew that he was coming towards the end of his life, that I couldn't hold his hand and tell him that I loved him and thank him for the past and pray with him. I did have the privilege online of praying with him as he asked me to remind him of the gospel, and I reminded him of the faith that he'd placed in Jesus as a young lad at a Billy Graham crusade all those decades ago. And he would say, yes, preach it, amen, thank you, through the pain. And then one morning I got a phone call from Jo, and through the tears she said, Dad's died. A couple of weeks later, I was on a Zoom call with two of my very close Baptist minister friends. We've been Zooming throughout this lockdown every 3 or 4 weeks. We've needed it. And they said, how are you? And I was in my study, and I punched my desk as hard as I could. It hurt my hand. And I said, God has not answered one prayer that Jo asked me to pray about her dad. He even died on Seb's birthday, and I was livid with God because every prayer we'd prayed had clearly not been answered with a yes. And I know that some of you might say, oh Neil, sometimes it's wait, sometimes it's no, sometimes it's you don't understand. And I know I'm not being flippant, I've done the Alpha course and all of those things. But in that moment, my faith in God was frail. It was still there, and it still is. But the danger can be that we only share the Martha Vineyard moments of faith, or those early beginnings of faith, and not the Hurricane Katrina, as you can see on the screen behind me, moments of faith, when everything feels like it's falling apart. Because that God, who is faithful in the Old Testament, when I say yes, in a campfield in Wales, and when I hear his voice in Martha's Vineyard, is the same God who is there for me and with me when my father-in-law breathed his last. Let's not kid ourselves that our faith is about how faithful we are. It's about full of faith or feebly in faith, placing our trust in God. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message version of the Bible, he says faith is a long obedience in the same direction. And I love that sentence. It's just saying, God, I'm going to keep going with you no matter what. Michael Frost is an Australian author and writer and preacher and teacher. And on Facebook this week he said, I was just reading an assignment by one of my students, Dean Johnston, the pastor of Hinterland Chapel in Byron Bay, who wrote this about his church, and I had to share it. We meet under the shade of a large rainforest fig tree. The tree is the central focus of our seating plan. Its canopy is our cathedral. The grassed earth is our floor. The birds are our perpetual choir, and the large buttress roots form the cathedral's sanctuary. The tree was planted several generations ago and is a continual testament to how the seeds we plant today will provide shelter for the generations of the future. Beautiful. Friends, let's have faith in a God who's planted trees hundreds of years before we were here that will continue to grow long after we breathe our last. A God who has sown seeds in our lives that do bear fruit through our good work. It's a long obedience in the same direction. Nothing more, nothing less. Bless you.